Hey guys, so the topic is you don't have to be qualified because God has already pre-qualified you. So a lot of the times we look at our purpose and we're just like, I'm not worthy enough to do this. I've done this and I've done that, and I don't think that I'm worthy enough to do what God has called me to do. And so, anyways, I used to be a cashier at Sam's Club, and one of my responsibilities was to sell credit cards. And it was a little bit harder to sell to the people that weren't pre-qualified, because as soon as I asked, they immediately began to list off this long list of reasons as to why they would not get that. And so they'd be like, oh, my credit and blah, 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 blah. I wouldn't get this because I did this on my credit and all that stuff like that. And I'm like, you know what? Just try it out and maybe you'll get it. And then boom, they got it. They were qualified. So Moses gave many reasons as to why he shouldn't have been the one to free God's children. In Exodus 4:10 through 12, Moses pleaded with the Lord. He said, "Oh Lord, I'm not very good with words. I never have been, and I'm not now. Even though you have spoken to me, even though you have given me a plan, I get tongue-tied and my words get tangled." Then the Lord asked Moses, "Who makes a person's mouth? Who decides whether people speak or don't, hear or not, see or not? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go. I will be with you as you speak and instruct you in what you say." Don't you think that God is going to lead you and guide you when you walk in what He has for you? When God qualifies you, nothing can unqualify you. So not anything that you do, not anything that anybody says. I know that, a lot of parents tend to put their own children down. Oh, you just like your daddy. You just like your auntie and uncle. You ain't gonna never amount to anything and all of that. But I come to tell you today that let them say whatever it is that they want to say, because they cannot unqualify you for what God has qualified you for. It was tradition that the firstborn got the blessing. So Samuel came to anoint Jesse's son. David was the last to be thought about. So David's outside where he stay with the sheep. He stank, he dirty, and he's out there worshiping God. God, my heart pants for you like the deer pants for the water. He's out there, he's worshiping. I'm pretty sure that he can hear the party in the house. Everybody is notified that, Samuel is coming to anoint a king from this household. Everybody, gets dressed up and they finna have a party. They throwing a party. Pretty sure David can hear this. And even though that David is left out, that still doesn't stop him from what he was already pre-qualified to do. He went through all of Jesse's children. He said, there's gotta be more. There's gotta be somebody else. It ain't none of y'all, so where he at? And so they finally go and they get David. He wasn't even told about what was happening. So first, they had to go and clean him up so that he can come before Samuel. And when David get in the room, they say, "Rise, there go your king." And Samuel anoint him to be king. He was left out. He slept out the door. I mean, he was the keeper of sheep. He was a shepherd. And I couldn't imagine, how, being left out feels, because we've all had that time where we were left out. But even though people leave you out, God's not going to leave you out. He still has a plan for you, that he says that his plans are meant for good, not for evil. So have you ever, when you were younger, come back in the house from playing and an older person told you that you smelled like outside, you were probably only out there for a few hours, but David lived out there still. He was anointed king, and he was always left out and put last. The Bible says that the last shall be first. Never invited to the party. And then Esther was not qualified in the eyes of people to be queen because she was an orphan. She was actually adopted by her cousin Mordecai, and they were Jews. So she was not qualified to be queen, but she was chosen queen. Out of all the women that had come before King Xerxes, he chose Esther, the orphan. She didn't have no mother, she didn't have a dad, but God still had a plan for her. She was still qualified for what God had pre-qualified for her. So even though she had certain circumstances that in the human eye would have disqualified her, God had qualified her to be queen. So Esther the orphan was queen. In this day and time, you hear a lot of people blaming things on their MIA parent. I've heard a lot of guys say, my dad wasn't in my life, so there's a lot of stuff that men do that I can't. Or my mother left me when I was smaller, so how am I going to be a parent when I didn't even have a father or a mother? Just because you thought you didn't have a parent doesn't mean Daddy God ain't pre-qualified you for something great. Mordecai went from being outside the palace with burlap and ashes on his head to being honored by the king. So in this story, Esther is able to stand in the gap for her people. So there was someone named Haman who had it out for Mordecai because Mordecai wasn't one of the people that were shaking in their boots when he passed by, and he was upset about that. So he had set up a 75-foot pole for Mordecai to be impaled on. And so anyways, there was a decree that they tricked the king into making to kill all the Jews on a certain day. And then Esther, being Jew, she was able to, in her calling that she was pre-qualified for, she was able to stand in the gap for her people. So she ended up, going to the king, even though that she wasn't supposed to just go to the king unless she was called. God pre-qualified for her for that. So she was able to go to the king and say, King, this decree that has been put in place, it's, gonna kill my people, if you're paraphrasing. And so that decree was reversed. And so, Esther was able to stand in the gap for her people and to save her people because of what God had pre-qualified for her to do. So anyways, Haman had set up this 75-foot pole for Mordecai to be impaled on, but instead he ended up being impaled on. And to me, that's just saying, your enemy will set a trap for you and then end up falling in it. So Mordecai was rode through town with the king's robe and ring on the king's horse. And they both ended up being saviors for every Jew that was in that kingdom. Mordecai was promoted in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. Saul was a Christian slayer and ended up having his name changed to Paul and known as one of the greatest apostles. So Saul around here killing Christians. One day he killing Christians, next day maybe not the next day, but He's known as one of the greatest apostles. So he's a murderer. And, you know, a lot of people would say, oh, you can't be no preacher. You can't be no apostle at all, let alone the greatest apostle. You were just killing Christians. And now you gonna be the greatest apostle? You're not qualified for that. But still, he was one of the greatest apostles. So John was preparing the way for the Lord and baptizing people, and he was always making known that he wasn't worthy. John 1:27 says, though his ministry follows mine, I'm not even worthy enough to untie the straps of his sandals. So no matter what you think disqualifies you for what God has for you, it is still for you. It makes me think of Joseph. So he was a dreamer. He was kept on having dreams, and it was basically showing you like the pre-qualifications. When I was at Sam's, it didn't even have to tell me that people were pre-qualified or whatever, because like I would bleep the card and then it'll just pop up this long thing like, hey, this member is pre-qualified for this, you need to tell them about this or whatever. And so basically that kind of makes me think of, you know, Joseph. I know it's crazy, but he was a dreamer, and he kept dreaming about the crops, bowing down to those his crops, and about how there were the cows, and some of them were fat and some of them were small, and basically this just saying, hey Joseph, you're pre-qualified for this. And so anyways, he kept telling his family about that, basically about, you know, how his family would be bowing to and others will be bowing to him. And basically that's just saying, congrats, you've been pre-approved / pre-qualified. So even though his family, his brothers were mad, they threw him down into a well and they left him there to die. And then they were like, no, you know what, let's sell him. So they sold him into slavery. Even though Joseph went through all of this stuff, he was still pre-qualified for what God had for him. Yes, we've done this, and this has happened to us, but we're still pre-qualified. What God has for you is still gonna happen. And anyways, he was sold into slavery by his own brothers. He was still pre-approved. He was lied on and put in prison and forgotten. So when he ended up being sold into slavery, he ended up being put right up under the king, Potiphar. He ended up being put right, he was next in command under Potiphar. And his wife wanted to lay with him and he wouldn't. His wife lied on him and got him thrown in prison for a long time. And then some of his friends were down there. He had made friends with some of his friends, and those friends had gotten out. And he said, hey, y'all, remember me. Tell the king about me. And his friends got up there, forgot, stayed in there a little bit more longer. And so he was put in prison. He was lied on, put in prison, and forgotten. But yet, he was still pre-qualified to be the one in the highest position under the king and to save his family during the famine. So he ended up being able to save his family when it came down to the famine and all of that stuff like that. Even when it looks, feels, and seems like you're a failure, you're not. You're still pre-qualified for what God has for you. Y'all ever heard someone say, if it walk like a duck, sound like a duck, it is? Well, no, you're not. You are not a failure, and you are pre-qualified. And what God has for you, what God has spoken over your life still stands. And it actually turns out that you're not a failure. It turns out that you're more than a conqueror. You are the heel protecting your healing. You're the lender and not the borrower. No weapon formed against you shall prosper. He shall never leave you nor forsake you, and nothing can ever separate you from his love. And when you call, he hears you. You think you're a mess, but it turns out you're blessed. You don't see it now, but we don't see the whole picture as Daddy God does. But just know that congrats, you've been pre-qualified. A famous scripture to close out, Jeremiah 29:11-13 says, "For I know the plans I have for you. They are plans for good and not disaster, to give you a future and a hope. And those days when you pray, I will listen. If you look for me, you will find me." So, and then also, everyone around thought that Jesus wasn't qualified because you see this little 12-year-old boy that's speaking, and he's a carpenter and the son of a carpenter. And so they're just like, where did Jesus get all of this knowledge from? He's speaking, and you're just like, who taught you? They were asking him that. Who taught you? They thought that he wasn't qualified to be using all these big words and to be, speaking and what the things that he was doing because of what he came from. But what you came from does not disqualify you for what God has qualified you for. The sins that you have committed does not disqualify you for what God has qualified you for. And nothing can, disqualify you for the things that God has qualified you for. So just know that. Don't say, I'm not qualified for this. Because what God has qualified you for, pre-qualified you for, nothing and no one can disqualify you from getting that blessing, from walking in that calling.